Hello. Let me ask you a question today. So why is it that so many people say, I want to be fluent in English, I want to finally speak confidently at work, and yet months later, nothing really changes, right? Well, it's because most people try to change their results instead of actually changing and focusing on their identity. And today I want to show you why this approach doesn't work and what actually works instead. And by the way, I was inspired by, you probably know, I love reading books. I'm a huge bookworm, so I always get inspired by the books I'm reading. And to record this podcast, well, I was quite inspired by the book Atomic Habits by James Clear. Of course, I've read it many times so far, but well, yeah, this is where I get my inspirations once in a while, so reading. So in the book Atomic Habits, there is this very powerful idea, I would say, and now focus. So results are what you get. Results are what you get. Processes are what you do, okay? And identity is what you actually believe in. And you know, the problem is that most people start at the top. So they focus only on results. Like, I want to lose weight, I want to improve my English, I want to grow my business. But they never actually ask, okay, but who do I need to become to achieve this? Who do I need to become? What kind of person do I need to become to, well, be able to improve my English, to be able to speak English fluently? So the biggest problem is that your old identity will always, to some extent, sabotage your new goals, because the behavior that is not simply aligned with your identity, with your values, simply doesn't last. So you might want to improve your English, right? But if deep down you believe, let's say, and this is something that I very often hear during one-to-one classes, well, I'm not really good at languages, I'm quite resistant to languages, well, I don't really have time to learn English, I don't really like learning grammar, then if you, deep down, if you believe in these statements, then you will always find a way to avoid doing the work. You will always find excuses not to just sit down and get down to work and do the exercises, for example. Okay? So let's make it practical. If you keep telling yourself, I'm bad at English, I don't have any talent, I don't have time to learn English, then at some point you will actually start believing it. And once you believe it, then, well, you just give up. You stop trying, right? So you avoid situations where you actually have to speak English. You skip learning sessions. You find excuses. So you tend to procrastinate because your actions always try to stay, well, consistent with who you believe you are, So let me give you a very personal example. I used to be the least flexible person ever. I hated physical education classes at school. I was super stiff, the worst in my class. And, I was kind of ashamed of that when it comes to gymnastics. So maybe I was a good runner, but when it comes to gymnastics, I was just terrible at that. And, all my friends knew that I was the last person on earth who'd ever become flexible, okay? And that was something I believed. So that was my identity, we could say. Identity I truly believed in. I'm terrible at gymnastics. I hate physical education. I can never be flexible. But then, a few years ago, probably 7 years ago, I would say, I started practicing yoga. Not because I felt a yoga person, but because I just wanted to see what happens if I just start showing up, consistently. And, day by day, practice by practice, I started collecting this kind of evidence. This evidence that, maybe I can actually become flexible. Maybe it's not truly determined that I will always be so stiff. Maybe I've got some limiting belief that I'm stiff, and because of that, I wasn't into sports and I wasn't into gymnastics. And, over time, interestingly enough, my identity started to change. And here's what's interesting. So once I started actually seeing myself as someone who, takes care of their body and mind, I started feeling more and more motivated and happy about my identity. And that gave me, in turn, even more motivation to keep going. Also, when I entered this, let's call it yogic path, because now I'm also a yoga teacher, by the way. So once I entered that path, other things started changing like automatically at the same time. So I started eating healthily, eating better. Like at that time, I gave up on eating meat. I started meditating, writing a journal, spending more time in nature. I started going to bed earlier, like taking care of my bed routine, like no phone, no scrolling. I started waking up earlier. I stopped drinking alcohol. And all that happened because some things were no longer aligned with my new identity, this kind of yogi identity, we could say. And then I could say a yoga teacher. So as you can imagine, we very often have these limiting beliefs. So I had this limiting belief I was like super stiff and not good at gymnastics. And that prevented me for many, many years from practicing any sports. Okay? And now here we are. I've changed my identity. I've changed my limiting beliefs and I'm a yoga teacher. Who would have thought, And by the way, motivation can very often make you start a given activity or a habit, like start learning English, start practicing yoga, right? Because it's much easier when you've got this motivation. But in the end, in order to maintain this habit, right, for years, let's say, like learning English, practicing yoga, eating healthily, it needs to simply, become part of identity. It needs to simply become part of who you are. Because if you only rely on motivation, then obviously, you can't really control it every day, right? Sometimes you have a lot of energy and motivation and sometimes you don't. So if you only rely on motivation and not this kind of identity factor, then, you might simply give up after a while. Another example. So the same thing regarding identity applied to my business. When I started building my personal brand, again, that was somehow like 7 years ago or 8 years ago. So it's actually funny, right? When you think of it, that practicing yoga and running my business kind of started at the same time. So I don't really know which element, affected the other, right? Because I practiced yoga, maybe I was more energetic, I had more flow, creativity, and that helped me grow my business, or maybe the other way around, right? So when I started my personal brand, when I was starting it, obviously I had to change my identity. So I started asking myself questions such as, okay, Asha, so if you want to be successful in business, then who do you need to become? Like, who do you need to be in order to be like a successful businesswoman, let's say? And obviously that meant like learning a lot of new skills, investing a lot of money in many business and marketing courses, but also at the same time completing these courses and implementing the knowledge and not only buying the courses, right? That meant working when I didn't feel like it. And sometimes I have to tell you that really meant working in the evenings instead of, watching a Netflix series and just chilling, choosing work over going out at weekends with my friends. And, not because I had to, but because I knew that I was kind of casting a vote, oddawałam głos, I was casting a vote for the person I wanted to become. So I was choosing this kind of temporary discomfort and effort for the sake of this future comfort. Okay? And I think nowadays the problem is that very often we want to achieve something, like great, results, but we are not really willing to change our identity. We are not really willing to make sacrifices, to make some actual effort, right? Very often we want the thing to be quick and easy and sweet and, just go with the flow. And with all the things that are usually important to us and worthwhile, they always take some time and effort, right? And coming back to the topic of my business and my business identity, we could say, later, even though my business, after a few years, my personal brand became quite successful, it kind of stopped growing. And, why? because I was unfortunately doing everything myself. I was this kind of do-it-yourself girl, Zosia Samosia. So I'll do everything better than others, right? This kind of perfectionist attitude. So I had to change my identity again in order to, move forward. So I had to move from, doing everything on my own to simply thinking like a CEO. And that meant asking questions like, okay, so what would a good CEO do? And the answer again was quite obvious to me. So first of all, I really had to delegate tasks which I didn't really have to do myself, okay? Maybe tasks which were technical. That obviously meant letting go of some unnecessary things, unnecessary projects, unnecessary tasks, and simply focusing on this business strategy rather than some kind of ongoing, petty, technical activities. And again, it all started with identity. Like, who do I need to become in order to grow my business even further? And now, let's bring it back to English, okay? So instead of saying, I want to be fluent, I want to be confident when speaking English at work, just ask yourself, okay, what kind of person actually becomes fluent in English? And the answer that is going to come to you will probably be, probably someone who practices like regularly, possibly every day, someone who reviews vocabulary, possibly every day, someone who simply shows up, like even for 10 minutes every day. So before you go, here is a simple idea I want to just leave you with. So every action you take is simply a vote for the kind of person you want to become. So every time you practice your English, you simply vote for, becoming a confident English speaker. And every time you skip it, then, you vote for staying exactly where you are. So possibly next time you think, I don't really feel like learning English today, working on my business today, or whatever, going to the gym today, then ask yourself a question, okay, so what kind of person do I want to be? Okay? And act accordingly. Take decisions based on that and not based on your motivation. So even if it's just 5 minutes, like seriously, even if it's just a minor activity, like a baby step towards the person you want to be, because that's how identity is built, day by day, habit by habit, consistency, right? And once you start seeing yourself as someone who consistently works on their English, it will simply become much easier to actually take action, to build this habit of regular learning. And, over time, to truly just improve your English. So I hope you've enjoyed this mindset-related episode. I've decided to include such episodes once in a while because I do believe that, learning English is also, or being like a fluent speaker, is also about your identity, is also about changing your mindset, right? Hence the idea to record such episodes for you. So of course, let me know what your reflections are after this episode. And of course, don't forget to follow the podcast if you want more mindset and practical English tips like that. Cheers!